pleasure to welcome author Karr Roberts. Tara is a freelance writer focusing on science. She is a newspaper columnist, a lifelong Idahoan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and the author of Wild and Distant Seas. Tara is in conversation today with writer, historian, executive director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, and co-chair of the Nantucket Book Festival Literary Committee, Mary Bergman. Woo! Please put your hands together and welcome Tara and Mary to the stage.
Wow, we're here. We made it. And we were just talking beforehand, planning the festival is this year-round effort. And it's always like, there comes a point in putting the schedule together where we realized, oh, we're gonna have a festival, and we felt that very early on, and we were very lucky. It's always exciting when there's a book out that's new, that has a Nantucket connection, but it's also about so much more than that. So I'm really happy that you all came out today to hear more about Tara's beautiful book, and that cover is it's so beautiful. You need this on your shelf. You really do. You can send me my percentage. Just kidding. So I first met Tara online, of all places. She was doing research for this book and was supposed to come out to Nantucket. But it was the summer of 2020, I think. April 2020. That didn't happen. She did eventually come out, obviously, and she's here now. And I realize I'm getting ahead of myself, though, that I would love for Tara to tell us a little bit about the novel before we start talking about her process and some of the themes.
All right. Thank you all for being here. This is really cool. Wild and Distant Seas starts with a very minor character from Moby Dick. I'm sure a lot of you actually probably remember the Nantucket chapters of Moby Dick if you've read it, which not everybody does, but there is this innkeeper who slings chowder and kind of yells at Queequeg and Ishmael and is a bit of a slapstick character. But she's also one of only 2 women who talk at all in the book, have any lines of dialogue. And the one with the biggest part at all in that big giant book is this little innkeeper. And so my story starts with her and follows those chapters of Moby Dick, but then it springs off on its own and takes place over the course of 4 generations all over the world. So Nantucket, Boston, northwestern Brazil, Italy, and Idaho, where I'm from. And kind of follows these unusual women who have unusual powers and are all, whether they should be or not, chasing this memory of Ishmael or they don't actually even know who he is at some points, this memory of Ishmael, who their grandmother or great-grandmother encountered on Nantucket.
It's really good. Actually, you were talking about Moby Dick. We do know that Nantucket chapter. We know the Chowder chapter. That's a big favorite. We used to have it's been a while, maybe, but we have had Moby Dick marathons in this very room. And Nat Philbrook often reads that chapter, or the Chowder chapter. When did you first encounter Moby Dick?
So I kind of diligently avoided Moby Dick for a good part of my life, especially considering that I'm a book nerd. I liked Melville. I fell in love with Bartleby the Scrivener when I was in high school, but kind of did the, super long book about like dudes on a ship, not my thing. I'm fine. I worked at the University of Idaho for many years, and while I was working there, I could take classes for very inexpensive, so I earned a master's in English, and the very last class I took was 19th century novels, and the very first book we had to read was Moby Dick. And my friend who taught the class, I went in and I was like, dude, I don't know if I can do this. And he said, just start it, it's going to surprise you. And he was absolutely right. It was funnier and weirder and darker than I had imagined, and I very quickly fell in love with it and very quickly fell in love with the character that I ended up naming Evangeline. So the book started actually as a project for that 19th century novels class 6 years ago, strangely enough.
Did you ever feel intimidated by engaging with such a, I mean, how many people have read Moby Dick? This is probably not your average American cross-section, but
It's true.
but it is, you're right, it is a scary text. It's huge, and you just think, I don't want to read about whaling implements, and but it's hilarious, as you say.
Yeah.
Was it kind of scary, though, to take your novel begins with the germ of an idea that came from something that has so much like weight and is very fraught, I think, in a lot of people's high school imaginations?
Yeah. I think it helped in some ways that it started off as a class project because it felt, I kind of gave myself permission to experiment. I was doing something for fun to some extent. And when it became like, oh, I'm working on a novel and not a class project and not a short story, I had some of those moments where I was like, what am I doing? Who am I kidding? Like, the joke I keep making is if I had taken a time machine back to the day before I started writing this novel and said, okay, hey, good news, you're gonna write a novel, which I've always wanted to do. It's going to be about Moby Dick. I just would have laughed. I would have been like, this is a joke. Why would I do that? But by then I was so deep into it, and I was so, I guess, just in love with my characters, and I had pulled that thread out of Moby Dick. But when I went from, oh, this is a short story to, oh, this is a novel, I basically immediately decided, okay, we're gonna leap away from Moby Dick now. I didn't want to write something entirely paralleling it, partly because that world already exists. I wanted to pull out that world that wasn't there yet. We really, in that class, dug into the history of Moby Dick and the context of it and how people have viewed it over the years. And there's that, it's the microcosm of America. But to me, it's missing half the world. And I wanted to write that world. And so it was pretty easy to say, I'm not trying to rewrite Moby Dick. I'm not trying to reinvent it. I'm creating what's not there. And that, it was fun. Though there are times where I'm like, oh man, someday the Moby Dick scholars are gonna come after me because I did something wrong. But the ones I have talked to are lovely people, so we're good.
It really does, the novel is expansive in pretty much every sense of the word, and you're not on Nantucket for long before you're thrust into all the other great places that Tara was telling us about. And I'm wondering what sort of research that you did is not only like Melville, we won't just talk about Nantucket the whole time, but this is the Nantucket Book Festival, and it is the first thing. But like Melville, you hadn't been to Nantucket before you started writing, but you also hadn't been to the 1820s, and so you went to many different places in time and history. What was the research like there, and how did you decide kind of where your travelogue was going to take you?
So I mentioned I have a background as a journalist and a science writer. I had been really intimidated by historical fiction, though, because I was like, oh, it's so much research. And then when I started doing this, I went, wait, no, I love research. This is fun. So we can stay on Nantucket a little bit. I can talk about the research I did here, because I comforted myself throughout the early part of my process by telling myself that Melville himself had not been to Nantucket before he wrote Moby Dick. I'd been to Boston, but that was about it as far as going over the Rockies from the west. So for, even just for the Nantucket part, I kind of build my research and my writing in layers, where I like some things that give me a foundation so I have a sense of where I'm at. I read Nathaniel Philbrick's Away Offshore, of course. I read The Other Islanders by Francis Ridley Cartoonan. And one of the wonderful things that this library has done is digitize decades and decades and decades of the Enquirer and Mirror. So I spent a lot of time in those archives. One of my favorite things about old newspapers is the advertisements, because you can dig into what everyday life looked like. What did people buy? Where did they go? What did they do for fun? Where did they go to eat? What kind of food did they buy? And so kind of starting there, but then there's so many layers, other little rabbit holes to go down as I started building the story on top of it. So one of my favorite research stories to tell is I have the character of Queequeg, and my character interacts with him in ways that we don't see in Moby Dick. And I wanted to make sure that I was getting the culture of his tattoos correct. And that was a rabbit hole, and I was trying to, because the way Melville describes them, they typically say, oh, it's this Maori man that he's based on, but the way he describes the tattoos don't quite match Maori tattoos. And so I went down rabbit hole of Marquesan tattooing, and I got through interlibrary loan at my university this 1920s German art book that's just illustrations of Marquesan tattooing, and it got delivered to the wrong office, and I got this wonderful phone call that's like, we have a book for you. It's in German. We don't know what it is. And it was this big, giant art book. But little sidetracks like that may only end up being a few details in the novel, but are indulging me to some extent. But also then when I describe his tattoos and the meaning behind them and how he treats them, I felt like it adds that level of hopefully authenticity and richness. I also do a lot of interviews whenever I can, so I interviewed Mary. And then I had a friend of a friend who had worked here on the island as an educator for a long time, Corey Fabian Barrett, who also indulged me with some interviews, especially when it was April and May 2020, and I was not sure I would ever get here. I had a grant from the Idaho Arts Commission, and they were thankfully very generous and shifted it all for a year so I could come out. And then the on-island research, which I know we'll talk a little bit more soon. But yeah, the rest of, figuring out where to take the book was a little bit intimidating because, again, I had not traveled basically at all when I was writing this. I've gotten to do some since then, but Boston was fairly easy. I had a very good friend from high school who was a historian and librarian in Boston, and so she gave me some wonderful recommendations, and I'd actually been to the city with her. Brazil was a little bit of a gamble. So there's chapters in Moby Dick where there's one chapter, the Town Ho story, where Ishmael says, this one time I was in Peru talking to my buddy, and here's the story that we told. And so I knew that I wanted my characters to try to get to Peru and fail along the way. So I literally got out my globe and some shipping maps, and I went, okay, where are we going to end up? And picked northeastern Brazil. I also tried to recognize my limits when I was doing research, and that was really a place where I knew that I wanted to construct a very, very, very contained and very unusual community. Partly for the story, I was trying to figure out, how can I make a community of women happen in rural Brazil in the 1880s? And I landed on something adjacent to, but not quite, an abbey, or it's called a recolhimento, which would have been a school for girls, but it's also not quite that either. But also to recognize that, I can't go to 1880s Brazil. I couldn't get to literal right now Brazil. How do I make sure that I put boundaries around this so that I am working with things that can feel real to the reader? And then some of it was also recognizing what I had to let go of. That, like you said, I can't go to the past. I'm a really avid reader of science fiction and fantasy, and I realized at some point that, the past is also a place you can never go. You're building a world the same way that you're building it if you're building something for sci-fi. So recognizing, okay, here are the things that I'm really committed to getting right. Here are the things that I'm willing to stretch, and here are the things I'm willing to let go was part of that research process also. And then, I did myself a favor by setting part of it in Italy. I actually rewrote the last third of this book many times and set it all sorts of different places. And finally, I actually went to Italy on a grant from my university while I was writing this book. I wrote most of the Brazil section in Italy, oddly, and went, you know what? I'm going to put part of this book where I've been, just to give myself a break. And then bringing it back to Moscow, Idaho, where I'm from, was a treat because even though I have lived there for most of my life, I didn't live there in 1902. So I got to explore that in a completely new way also.
I really loved when the characters got there and
Thank you.
their reactions to
That is based on other people's reactions to coming to Moscow, Idaho.
It really, it's just such a beautiful journey through time and space, and I'm intrigued to find out that you're a sci-fi fantasy fan, because I think that it's like all the gears in my head just kind of shifted into place when you said that, because you really anyway, brings me to the next question, which is there is an element of not fantasy but magical realism in the book. And is that something that you had always wanted to include, that your characters would have these, psychic abilities or, powers beyond the average human? Or did that come as you were writing the story? How did you get there?
So it did come from the very beginning. So the first line of this novel is a couple words off the actual first line I wrote for the whole thing from the beginning. And I knew from the time I wrote that first scene that Evangeline was in some way magical, though it took a long time to pin down how. So some of that was for me. So I learned as a young writer, I tried really hard to be what I thought a short story writer should be or a novelist should be, and then pretty quickly figured out that I enjoyed my work a lot more and I did a lot better work when I let myself be as strange as I wanted to be. And so I knew that if I was going to write this story, it needed to have something in it that was something I would enjoy. And I also love the idea of, I knew that I wanted to rebuild these scenes from Moby Dick from the perspective of this innkeeper. And I knew that I wanted her to have something else going on in her life that Ishmael was obviously completely ignorant of. And I went, it can be magic too. And then as I kind of built it out into a novel, I'm interested in the ideas of, family stories, how we pass things among generations, but also how, especially women, view their own power and abilities in the world and how the world tries to harness or change or suppress those and how it changes how we view ourselves. And so the magic was very fun, but also became kind of a useful way of exploring how these women encountered the world and limited themselves in it and liberated themselves in it through these things that they could do, these psychic powers that they had.
It's like women's intuition to the 9th degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you haven't read the book, the very first line is, "It took me some time to appreciate the smell of dead fish." And honestly, when I read this first page, I remember I stopped, I took a picture of it, I sent it to my sister, and I said, "This book is so bleeping good." I said, "I can't." It was like, the line, Tara's writing on the line level is just so beautiful. Are you a poet? Do you read poetry?
I am not a poet at all, but I do read it avidly, and a couple of my friends who helped really encourage me along early on in this process and read drafts of it are poets, and I owe them a lot for their insight.
I think that really does, shine through. Sorry, let me see my notes. When you were on Nantucket, between when you wrote the novel and you came here, and then you were revising and editing and ultimately the final draft, did anything change that you'd written about Nantucket that you were like, oh God, no, that's wrong? No one would walk down that street, or?
Yeah, that was actually a really fun thing because I had written the Nantucket sections of this novel 3 years before I came here, but I knew the novel wasn't done yet. And I love revisions, so I'm always happy to be like, oh yeah, we got to fix that. One of the biggest things that changed is I have characters who are teenagers who are meeting clandestinely to look at some newspapers that they think are going to help them crack a mystery. And I had originally set those meetings in this building. And then I had tried, I had looked online for every picture of the interior that I could find, and I kind of messed around with some things, and then I got here and I walked in and I went, oh no, teenagers can't sneak around in here. Though I love that there is a special teenager section. I have teenage children at home and they would think that was so cool. But especially when it was not yet a public library and my characters, for various social reasons, should not have been seen together. So I ended up inventing, because I'd read about, I think it was Petticoat Row, where there were a lot of stores run by women. I invented a store that in my head is shaped the same as Mitchell's Book Corner with that upper area, and had my characters meet there because in part the proprietors don't really care what they're doing up there. So they had a place to sneak around. That was one of the biggest things that changed. And then also just, I feel like I was able to add a little bit of depth of environmental detail. I was here in May 2021. I was in the off season, and it was still quite COVID-y, especially coming from Idaho, where to be honest, everything was more open than it should have been, and then in Massachusetts, where everything was still closed. I spent a lot of time just walking the island, and finding, the plants and the sand and the shape of things that I went, oh, I can slip that in. I can find a little place to put that. And then I had another detail that I was gonna share that I added, now I have to remember what it was. Oh, so I stayed at the Brass Lantern Inn when I was here, and I had a kind of layout of the inn that my character lives in my head, and I had done some research to kind of help inform that. But when I went back and revised those chapters, I refined them. Now I had that particular building, because it is a historic house and historic inn, in my head, and it helped a lot. Even if maybe you can't quite tell on the page, it helped me formulate how these characters moved through that space.
Sort of touched on this a little bit, but and it's funny. I didn't really get the interlocking circles until I was looking at it today.
It's funny, I didn't get it either, and my editor was like, "Tara, the circles. There's 4 generations."
Because as I said, I think it's just a fabulous cover. Don't judge a book by its cover, but it's okay. We all do. So you have these 4 generations, these interlocking circles, these themes of inheritance, of trying to figure out, how does the past influence our future? Are we able? We can't change the past. Anyway, I'm just wondering, what is one thing, that you are hoping to pass down, to your next generation, whether that's, your immediate family or just, people who you influence.
Yeah.
And the idea of inheritance, I don't know.
I've been thinking about this since I saw this question, because I went, oh, that's no one's asked me quite that.
This is why.
It's true, and I do. My older son has read the book, even though he mostly reads horror novels, so it was a new path for him. But thinking about that, if my children encounter my work, if future generations someday do it, what would it be? And I think that the thing that kind of popped in my head is that need for other people, that you do in fact need a community. Because one of the things that my characters tend to do is isolate themselves or view themselves as isolated. And the thing that repeatedly saves them is these people who just love them for no reason. They haven't asked for it, they maybe don't deserve it, but they're there when they need them. And that would be a really important thing for me from my kids. And I think it's the thing that keeps showing up in a lot of my work. I have a big, giant, proud, extended family. I dedicated the book to my mother's aunts and grandmothers, because there are a lot of them. I'm from a part of North Idaho where people have kids quite young, so I knew my great-great-grandmother. She lived till I was 11. And my great-grandmother, they lived in an apartment house that my grandparents built for them, so I used to go over after school and play cards. And so that you need a connection to family, but also you can build a family wherever you are and whoever you're with. Because some of my characters have to do that. They are not in a position to be cared for by their family, so they build families.
That's a theme, that comes up a lot in the book, the idea of found families. It's a novel about people searching for themselves, searching for the past, trying to navigate a new, hopeful future for themselves. And there's a lot to keep in your head. There's a lot, different sections, different generations. And how, as a writer, were you able to ground yourself when you were writing something that is so big and expansive?
I did use spreadsheets for some of it. Like I learned how to make a formula so that you can calculate what age people are at different points in time. And I have a really big spreadsheet that tracks, because I didn't want to accidentally make someone 120 or have them have a kid at 14 or whatever. But a lot of it was, I draft pretty linearly. And so when I was in a new section of the book, and that was part of how I encouraged myself through it. This is my first novel, and it is genuinely the first novel I wrote, is I kept going, okay, this is just 5 short stories stacked on top of each other. You can do this. So when I entered a new character space, I did that foundational historical research. And I've discovered that I struggle to write a character until they have a name, and the name is right. And once I kind of had those 2 pieces, I write by daydreaming is what I call it. I take long walks. I live in this beautiful little town in farm country, and I walk my dog, and I just think and just let my brain kind of go and chase these characters around this space and see where we end up. And a lot of things change along the way, but I tend to like to know kind of where I'm going and who I'm going with, and then chase it and see. And that kind of, I would force myself a little bit to stay in those immersive spaces. Like when I started being like, oh, wait, no, I know what's going to happen with the next character, I wrote it down and I put it away. And I stayed in that space. And when I went back to revising, that was a big challenge in revision, is I'd written kind of 5 chunks and I had to make them work as a whole. But I would still try to stay in like the headspace of the place and person that I was writing at the time. And at the time, very disorganized notes. One of the things I learned as a writer writing this book is that I need to be organized. So now I have one document that I write notes in for any project ever. But trying to give myself permission to wait for later for the things that I wasn't thinking about yet, so that I could be fully immersed in the project and the piece of the project that I was on.
How do you get those names so right?
Oh, it just takes time. This is, I hope not a strange confession for history buffs. I love graveyards. I love cemeteries. I spent a lot of time in cemeteries with my mom during COVID, because that was like our field trip we would do, is we'd go to all these rural cemeteries. So sometimes I look for names on gravestones. But I also, especially in this book, I had a professor years and years ago talk about that names are very powerful, no matter what you're writing. Like there's all sorts of legacy and mythology from all over the world about the power of names, but when you're writing a book, you're giving a lot of power to a character through what you name them. So I did pick each name fairly deliberately, and there's research that went into all of them. One example is Rachel is the second narrator of my book, and that's the name of the ship that rescues Ishmael at the end of Moby Dick. So.
Chills. It's all like an iceberg, right? Where you can just see a very little bit up above, and down below is so much bigger. So we have a couple of minutes before we'll be moving, or I was going to say a couple minutes before the book signing. So I'm wondering, does anybody in the audience have any questions? Oh, okay. Great. I knew there'd be some.
It's more like a comment. Something you said about Moby Dick, that the innkeeper attracted you as a character. It reminded me of a painting I saw, Rembrandt's Prodigal Son. It's in Moscow.
Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, what's interesting about it is I read it's a beautiful painting, but I read a Henry Nouwen book. He's a great author, but he wrote just on the men. Well, obviously they were important, but in that, and he was talking about the painting in the biblical story. Anyway, there's a woman right in the middle of the painting, the prodigal son, and she's a bit washed out. And he wrote his book, but he never ever said anything about the woman. And what he wrote about the men was brilliant. But I thought to myself, well, if that interests you, there's a woman that Rembrandt must have put her right in the middle.
So many stories like that we could tell. Because Margaret Atwood's going to be here. I'm reading her the Penelopead right now, which is her story of Penelope's side of the Odyssey, which is so cool. Thank you.
Great. Sorry.
Could you say a little bit more about how you chose your title?
Oh, how I chose my title, yes. So the book was originally called The Chowder Woman, after that character. But when it became a novel, I went, I need a more expansive title. And I searched and searched and searched, and I knew I probably wanted to pull it from Moby Dick. And I reread all of those beautiful poetic passages and read right over the top of Wild and Distant Seas a bunch of times, even though that's in, I think, the first chapter. And eventually went back and went, well, I guess I'm just going to have to read it from the beginning to find a title, and ran into that and went, that is absolutely it. In part because it's just a beautiful phrase, and it's in an exceptionally beautiful part of the novel. For a while I had that paragraph memorized. I don't think I do anymore. But I liked both that my characters do, to some extent, some of them literally go out to sea, but also that emotional idea, especially writing what you could consider in some ways a domestic novel, this idea that, the men went out to sea, their stories were interesting, the women stayed home, theirs weren't, but that the experiences you have as a child and as a mother and as a neighbor and as a friend are as interesting and as expansive and as wild and meaningful as going out to sea.
Hi. If I understand right, you've written a number of short stories. This was your first novel.
Yes.
How did you, this is more about the publishing process and finding, did you have an editor? How did you get published? You know, is it self-published? What did you do?
I'm still surprised by this whole process. What I recommend to everybody first is there is a wonderful book called Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Maum, M-A-U-M, that helped me understand the publishing world a lot, and I recommend it to everybody. She also has a great newsletter. So I kind of hit the writer jackpot where I was certainly writing, and I was writing this as a short story, and I had a literary agent contact me because he had read an essay and then dug out. I hadn't even written that many short stories. I was a science writer. I had very small children. I was like thinking a novel would be lovely to write someday. But he contacted me and asked if I was writing a novel, and I sent him the story I was working on. I said, I think this is the beginning of a novel, and he agreed. Because usually finding a literary agent is the longest process. Most people write novels with no idea whether they're ever going to see the light of day, and I bypassed the first step by having him find me. But then it is also an incredibly long process of finding a publisher and an editor. And I tell the truth, even though they might not want me to. I got a lot of rejections, just so many. And that's part of why I rewrote a whole third of the novel at one point, because all the editors were saying the same thing, which is, we love this, but it's not working at the end yet. So it's good rejections is kind of what I saw it as. This is constructive. But I eventually found my wonderful editor at W.W. Norton. Her name is Helen Tmaides, and my agent kept saying, you just have to find one editor, that's all. Just one person has to get it. I actually have it as a Post-it note on my computer. You only need one editor to get it, and Helen got it, and she made the book better and was just delightful to work with. So thank you. The book I mentioned is called Before and After the Book Deal. And it was written shortly before COVID, so there are some things that changed. Like she says that, if you haven't found an editor within 6 months, maybe not. That is totally different now. Everything moves slower, but so slow.
When you came to Nantucket, what surprised you? Was everything as you expected?
It surprised me a lot, so many things. So I'm from North Idaho. Because the Pacific Northwest is very different culturally than New England. And I'd been to Boston, but Nantucket it looks different than anywhere else I've ever been. That feeling of my husband is here with me, and he's never been to the East Coast at all. And I was like, it's a different vibe than anything. But the beautiful wood shingles and the historic buildings and, everything here is older than anything in Idaho. But then also, the natural beauty of it really surprised and delighted me. I did the Sconset Bluff Walk, and it's just one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in the whole world. And then there is that wonderful juxtaposition of walking through the backyard of those mansions that are, like I said, older than any building at my university, older than any building in my town, some of them. And those are the two things that surprised me most.
I recently reread 1984, and out came, around the same time, the viewpoint of Julia, written by, obviously, another author. Is there a gathering of similar, analogous writing of novels now to show the other viewpoints, such as you mentioned now, and as also mentioned, are these fairly unique?
I think it's kind of an ongoing thing, which is really cool. And I didn't totally realize, like I said, I had that wonderful naivety of thinking this was just a class project. Didn't realize I was stumbling into that tradition. But one of the books I read while I was writing the book was The Red Tent by Anita Diamond, which is a retelling of the story of Jacob by his wives. And so there's really this kind of wonderful tradition that I've gotten to enter, and there are newer, it is certainly popular right now. Madeline Miller's Circe is fantastic. I read Percival Everett's James, which is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim. Also, that is probably the best book I've read this year so far, and I've read a lot of really good books. So it is interesting that there are so many stories that we love that have hit the point in culture where a lot of people are familiar with them, but there's always something missing. And there are so many writers that are willing to say I could do this too. And then, of course, there's also Ahab's Wife, which I think is about 20 years old now. And I very deliberately didn't read it because I didn't want to like accidentally cross-pollinate.
You read it yet?
I haven't. I just got it though, so I'm excited.
It is like an unbelievable book. It's beautiful. And she was, I'm looking at Betsy, but I don't know why. You got to read Betsy's books too. About women at sea. But there's another question.
Now that you've explored world building in this historical fiction context, do you see yourself at any point moving into fantasy or sci-fi?
Oh, maybe. It's because some of my short stories that I've written are more, magical realism sci-fi tends to be kind of where I live. What I kind of discovered too is I also want to be one of those writers who can do what I feel like in the moment, which is maybe very ambitious. Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of my favorite writers. Her first novel was called Gods of Jade and Shadow, and it's very mythological and very fantastic, but then she's also written, she wrote a noir novel, she wrote a Hollywood novel, she's written all these wonderful things. The project I'm working on now is actually much more rooted in the real world, except the people in it think that there are a lot of not real world things happening. And I kind of just feel like I'm gonna chase after whatever comes my way, and that might be fantasy or sci-fi again someday.
It's very, very intriguing. I think we have time for one more question. Uh-oh. We actually took it out of our speech to turn off your cell phones part because we figured we've all had cell phones for 15 years, but that's another reminder.
Tara, is Idaho or Nantucket heaven? And how do you integrate in your life the unique virtues of both? Which evidently you do.
I missed the first part of your question. Can you ask it again?
Is Idaho or Nantucket heaven? And I think they both have, what are the virtues? How do you integrate those virtues, which are, because I think you appreciate both.
I do. Idaho is a very complicated place, and that's something that there was a little room to explore here, but I do hope to do in future writing. I have, my family's been in Idaho for 25 years now or something like that, which out there is a long time. Maybe not so much here. But they're both fascinating, I would say. I don't know if either of them are heaven. Nantucket has been very good to me so far. I can say that. It's just, I brought you this good weather, thank you. I think it's just, I love being able to explore a place through the eyes of different people because they experience it in different ways. So it was so fun bringing a character to Idaho, to this town I've lived in and that I love with my whole heart, who did not want to be there and didn't know where she was and doesn't like it and is not happy to be there, and get to see new layers of it in that way. And my character, who is initially on Nantucket, comes here kind of escaping other things, but finds that she has certain struggles because of that. Her daughter, who is born here, has different challenges. I don't know, if heaven is an interesting place, I think they both are.
Well, I think that's a great question to end on. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much.